Afternoon all. This is the PWM5 solar charge controller, which started life as just an electronics project, but then became a product once I started selling them on eBay. Now, I think all electronics hobbyists dream of inventing some gadget, selling millions of them, and then retiring to live on a yacht in the Mediterranean. But is that what actually happened with this? How much money did this thing actually make me? Well, the first two sold on eBay for about £18 each, and that kind of set my sales price. But then the third one sold for £4.50, so at that point I started using fixed price listings. Now, this is a file containing all the parts that the controller uses, where I got them, the part numbers, and rough stock levels, although they were never very accurate. And at the bottom there's a total, and the total of all the parts came to just £3. I had to use the dollar sign, I can't remember why, but £3 and 2 pence. Now, if the average sale price was £18 and the cost of the parts was £3, then it looks like a reasonably healthy profit of £15 per unit. And I sold about 900 of these controllers. Well, let's just call it 1,000 to make the numbers easier. That's £15,000. Pretty good. Maybe not quite enough to buy a yacht, but not bad. But calculating profit is never that easy. There are always additional costs. One of which, of course, was postage and packing. I always did that free. Well, if you bought enough Jiffy bags, you could get them for about 10p each. The stamp for UK postage was 90p. It got much more complicated for overseas. PayPal cost, they take 3%, so that was about 75 pence. So the profit starts to drop down once you include all the additional costs. And there's one very big cost that you kind of can overlook, but it really is important that it's included. And that cost is labour. Now, I made all these controllers myself, but of course I always intended to give the assembly work to someone else and then pay them for the time they spent doing it. And it ended up taking about an hour and a half to make each unit. They were made in batches of 4, generally speaking. And the cheapest price you can buy labour for in the UK, or at least you could at that time, was £6 an hour, the UK's minimum wage. So an hour and a half, well, that's £9. So that's £18 minus 9 takes you down to 9, minus 3 takes you down to 6, 5, £4.25. I mean, if you add in other costs like electricity for the soldering iron, the heat gun, and the glue gun, you can get this down quite low. I mean, it's still a profit, and it's still a nice profit to get of a few pounds per unit, but it's not quite what it seems at first glance. Now, that hour and a half was split reasonably evenly between making the circuit board and then assembling it, and then fitting the wires and putting the outer covering on, and then of course ultimately with the black outer sleeve and the label. I did get fed up quite quickly with making the Vero board versions, so after about 300 or so I switched to a printed circuit board. This is one of the last panels of PCBs that I've partly made up. And one of the most difficult parts of making the Vero boards was cutting them to this fairly exact size. They're all pretty accurately cut. Here's a batch that I never actually ended up using. And one of the problems with cutting it was that although on this side I cut down a row of holes, here it was necessary to cut between a row of holes, and that's really difficult to do. So I'd start with pieces of pre-cut strip board like this, and then I made up these scoring guides, which are just 2 pieces of plastic with a aluminium strip inside. And then what you do is, I think it was this way, run them through here, scoring them like that, and you can see that that puts an initial score line very precisely actually between those 2 rows of holes. And then it was just a case of running it through this scoring jig. I can't remember now, 8 to 10 times, flipping it over and running it through on the other side. And eventually you'd score deep enough with the assistance of a knife to break it in half. Then, once the boards were cut to size and the edges sanded down, it was necessary to cut the track brakes, and I ended up using one of these drills with a little handle on, which come in printer ink kits for refilling printer cartridges. This is for drilling the hole in the printer cartridge. And I just remembered, I could remember the pattern of drill holes. I can't now, but I could then. And then it was just a case of drilling the track brakes that were needed. I think there were about 12 or 13. Then of course all the components have to be put through the holes and soldered into place, and I think there are something like 32 components. I can't remember whether that includes these 3 wire links. Wire links of course are always inevitable when using VeroBoard. I think this was one I tried with lead-free solder, but didn't get on terribly well with that, so I went back to leaded solder. Now you can see that the legs, 2 of the legs of the MOSFET are not cut off because the yellow and red wires were actually soldered right onto the legs of the MOSFET to minimise track resistance and that sort of thing. So you can probably understand why I went to a PCB quite quickly. The VeroBoard was pretty tortuous. But I think these PCBs ended up being about £1.25 each because they have routed edges, and it also has a silk screen. I thought it was important to put a silk screen on to help any assembly workers, if I eventually got round to using them, to identify where the components went. Of course, I never did get round to using assembly workers. And I even started down the road of using surface mount components. You can see there are 3 surface mount components on the back here, and I did of course have visions of making a fully surface mount version of this, but of course that never happened. It's very easy to get caught into that trap of spending all your time manufacturing your product, and then there's no time left to innovate and take the product to the next level, and that certainly happened with this. Now, after quite a lot of practice, I got pretty good at making the outer covering quite smooth and even. You can see from this early prototype that it's all very lumpy, and the label was horrible at that time. So I also had some production aids for fitting the sleeving. Now, in my early experiments with this stuff, I found it was very difficult to go from pre-cut lengths of sleeving, this is 38mm sleeving I think it is, to fitting it round the unit, because it always ended up going misshapen. So eventually I innovated this kind of halfway stage, and these are made by putting the sleeving over this vacuum cleaner nozzle and dipping it into boiling water in a kettle. But then of course they had to be washed and cleaned and cooled and dried, and they'd also get stuck on the vacuum cleaner nozzle, so I innovated this release mechanism so that they could be pushed off. And the final thing is that there is a hole in the black sleeve punched to let the LED light through, and for that I bought this fantastic old Penton & Sons punch, which didn't actually work because it was blunt, so I fitted these eyelets, and then that just goes in there and punches a hole. So, did my gadget make me a fortune? Well, I probably kept about £3 per unit in profit, and of course I got paid £9 for making each unit, but that's at minimum wage. Well, that's fair enough. A lot of people have to work for minimum wage. I was willing to do that for about 4 years. But when you've fitted 32 components to a printed circuit board and done that 900 times, you start to understand why the electronics industry was so keen to go to surface mount components and machine assembly. Now, I was very keen to go to a surface mount version of this device. I bought a lot of surface mount components, capacitors and resistors, and also some diodes here and transistors. There's the 2N3906. And now that I've released the source code for the microcontroller, which is the PIC12F683, anyone can build a revamp of this unit in any form factor, including surface mount. This is a very early experiment with the 12F683, just a flashing LED, and that still works, and I still power it up from time to time. So, to have made my fortune from this product, I'd probably have to have sold tens of thousands or even hundreds of thousands, but at an hour and a half assembly time per unit, there aren't enough hours in a lifetime to have done that. Cheerio.